Hello friends, welcome to Bronx Tales with your host, Bronxy B, and me, I'm Logan. Thank you for being here. As per usual, most of our pre-recorded episodes have kind of little nuggets of information. They are all intertwined. They don't really go with each other, but I like to bring the points to everybody's attention because I feel that each of them are equally as important in this case. Even the small, tiny details will cause a domino effect into other details that make them that much bigger in proving that Bryan Kohberger probably didn't do this crime and that the investigation was covered up and completely corrupt. And I'd like to start off with some information provided by the Cherokee Rose. She recently pointed out that the chime on the church is off by an hour in the body cam video. Check it out.
O'clock. Yes, this one's live right here. Sass and turkeys. I love Thanksgiving. Ethan's red Jeep is there. It's just his Jeep sits back. Okay, it's sitting back there. I promise. The Jeep is there. Okay. So the only people that are out there huddled up right now is her.
I wanted to make two different points regarding Dylan's statement of Kaylee going up the stairs with Murphy, flying back down, and being the one crying in the bathroom. 2 points I want to make on this. Number one is Dylan stated she knew it was Kaylee because she wears Doc Martens and she heard her flying down the stairs in her Doc Martens. Well, Kaylee didn't wear Doc Martens that night. And along with that, Dylan also stated that they all hung out in Kaylee's bed talking. There's even a video apparently of this at 2-something in the morning. So my question is, did Kaylee not take off her shoes when she got into her bed and was hanging out with everybody? I would assume she took her shoes off and Dylan would have known that. Not only that, Kaylee didn't wear Doc Martens. She was wearing those little white flat shoes that night, as we see on the Grub Truck video. So my question is, the Doc Martens that were randomly left strewn about in the living room, which were the only pair of shoes, which tells us everybody takes off their shoes and brings them to their bedroom, were those Doc Martens staged in the living room? Because Kaylee didn't have on Doc Martens, so she couldn't have heard Kaylee's Doc Martens running down the stairs. And also, why is there a random pair of Doc Martens in the middle of the living room then? And along with that, Dylan states that she thought it was Kaylee crying in the bathroom, in which a perpetrator said, "It's okay, I'm here to help you." My question is, if Kaylee ran upstairs and saw a perpetrator, screamed and said, "Somebody's here," and ran downstairs into the bathroom, it wouldn't make sense for that same perpetrator that she just saw to then approach her in the bathroom while she's crying and say, "It's okay, I'm here to help you." What would make more sense, though, is if a different perpetrator approached her and said, "It's okay, I'm here to help you," making her think somebody was actually there to help her. But it couldn't have been the person she already saw upstairs on the 3rd floor. Just again, proving more and more over that there's more than one perpetrator here. Now, DA, as in Devil's Advocates, recently came out with a theory, and I want to play that theory for you. Some of you might believe it, some of you might not. I don't even know if I personally really believe this theory, but I like where he goes with it because it gets people to think outside the box. I'm going to play it for you now and come back with my commentary.
Now, realizing this hypothesis, we're setting aside for the moment why the hit happened. I have reasons on why the hit happened, and I'll try to be brief about it at first, but that's not the important part of the hypothesis. The important part of the hypothesis today is explaining the missing time on the 911 call and what happened with Bryan Kohberger pleading guilty. My hypothesis explains all of that in a neat nutshell, but I want to lay some things out. So let's say, for example, that someone was going to be killed in that house. Now, I have a hypothesis. One of the hypotheses is not the big hypothesis. The big hypothesis is about the knife sheath, the planted evidence. That's the big hypothesis, and the gap of the 9-hour time before they called 911. That's what I'm going to explain in this hypothesis. But there's another hypothesis that we're going to have for a second. I believe there's a possibility that Kaylee was one of the targets, if not the primary target. Let's set aside why Kaylee is one of the targets, but I believe that there's a possibility that Dylan Mortensen, for example, in this hypothesis, it is not fact, it is not proof, and I know that many of you say, we know what happened because Bryan Kohberger pled guilty. There's a scenario in this hypothesis of why somebody would plead guilty to something that they didn't do. They had to. They had no choice in this case. This was a rigged trial. It never was going to be a fair trial, and they needed, they being the prosecution, Idaho, the university, everyone needed to have a scapegoat, somebody that would go down for it. They could not let this be an unsolved crime, and so Bryan Kohberger is paying the ultimate price. That is part of the hypothesis, that guilty plea may not have been because he did everything that they said, maybe part of what they said. All right, so in this scenario, Dylan Mortensen lures Kaylee back to the house to make sure that she's there because she's an intended target of that weekend. There was a plan to hit that house, and Kaylee was going to be one of the targets, if not maybe the primary target. In this hypothesis, another part that we're going to set aside for the moment is that Brent Kopacka might have been employed along with somebody else to actually do the hit, that he had the skills to do what was happening. In this hypothesis that I've been saying, Bryan Kohberger and Brent Kopacka knew each other from Pennsylvania. I laid down many arguments on why they knew each other from Pennsylvania. Brent Kopacka may or may not even had a car. There's a scenario, and it seems to fit the logic of the timing of the routes of Bryan Kohberger leaving that night, that Bryan Kohberger literally was tipped off that now is the time. We're going to do something. And it's in my hypothesis, it's not even possible or necessary. It's not even necessary for Bryan Kohberger to know exactly what's going to happen. All he knows is he's asked to come pick up a friend, Brent Kopacka, and take him to an address. Now, one of the things I pointed out to you many times is that Molly McMichael said that when she was trying to deliver food to the house at 1122 King Road residence, her app took her in a circuitous route. It didn't take her to the front door of 1122 King Road residence. She had to drive around and around in circles trying to find the front of the house. Pay attention. One of the things I said to you as well is that if Bryan Kohberger also was using the same kind of GPS coordinates to get to the front of the house at 1122 King Road residence, where he's taking somebody else, let's say Bryan Kohberger is delivering somebody to the house because something's going to happen, and maybe Bryan Kohberger does or doesn't know what's going to happen, but he's simply a driver. He's bringing somebody to the house. If he's using GPS coordinates, and I know you say, well, Bryan Kohberger turned off his phone, doesn't mean he doesn't have another phone, because maybe he was smart enough, if he was involved in this, to turn his own phone off, but use a burner phone to do the location. The location, if Molly McMichaels is correct on GPS, would have taken him in a circuitous route around and around that house trying to find the front of the house. Ultimately, the GPS, according to Molly McMichaels, took her to the back side of the house where the sloped area was going down to the back door. That is also where people say in the official narrative against Bryan Kohberger parked. It was at the back of the house. Could it be because both of them were just simply using a typed in address, 1122 King Road residence, and the GPS was locating them and they were having problems finding the house, hence the reason for all the circling of the house, and hence also the parking at the back of the house where Molly said she parked and where they say that Bryan Kohberger parked. And if that's the case, it tells you several things. Bryan Kohberger didn't know that house. He wasn't familiar with the house. He was given a location. He was given an address, and GPS was taking him to the address. Molly McMichaels wanted to say, I was sitting right next to Kohberger. We both parked at the back side of the house. That, I believe, is a lie. Molly did not see him there. But it does tell us something interesting. Both of them were using GPS to find the location of 1122 King Road residence, and it took them to the back side of the house, where Bryan Kohberger was also allegedly taken to the back side of the house. All right, so follow the logic. At this point, Bryan Kohberger may just be delivering somebody. It's possible that he went and picked up a Brent Kopacka, who he knew from Pennsylvania, and Brent's like, hey, I need to go to this house. Can you take me there and drop me off? I'll just be a few minutes. In this scenario, it is possible Bryan Kohberger didn't even know what was about to happen in the house. He was taking a friend and dropping him off and then waiting for his friend to return. It is possible in my scenario that sometime during that event, Bryan Kohberger realized something was going horribly wrong. Maybe he heard screams. Maybe he saw something. Whatever the case may be, he peels out at a high rate of speed. I would say, in my hypothesis, the killer who he delivered to the house, maybe intentionally, maybe Bryan Kohberger did bring a killer to the house knowing what was going to happen. Or maybe he brought them unwittingly and sped off when he panicked and realized, oh my God, I hear screams from inside the house. Something horrible is happening. I got to get the fuck out of here. And he peeled off. That is is why also Brian Koberger would say when he was picked up and arrested, has anybody else been arrested for this crime? Because he wasn't actually there. I mean, he was there, but he wasn't inside the house. And he knows that he dropped off somebody. So he's curious. Did you get the guy who actually did it? Oh shit, I'm the guy you think did it because my car was there. He maintains his silence, but he also maintains his factual innocence. Why factual innocence? Because Brian Koberger knows he didn't go into the house. He couldn't have done it, but he's thinking that you guys are going to have to figure this out. You're going to figure it out. Maybe you put me there as a driver, but I wasn't in the house. So I'm maintaining my factual innocence. I wasn't in the house, and I know I wasn't in the house, and I can't wait to be exonerated. Problem is, in this scenario, Brent Kopacka, if he was one of the killers, went in there and got killed himself on December 14th, was it? It was one month and one day after the murders. He was shot and killed in Pullman, Washington. It was known by several people, and I've laid out the evidence that law enforcement may believe that Brent Kopacka was involved in the crime. I have pointed out just recently in a video how on December 5th, weeks before Moscow Police Department said that they even knew who Brian Koberger was, there's a document that lists 2 suspects and all the victims who were murdered. 2 suspects. One name is completely redacted. You don't know who it is. And on one of the many, many pages that shows multiple suspects, one name is unhighlighted. That is Brian Koberger on the 5th of December, which means that Moscow PD lied on the stand saying that they'd never heard of Brian Koberger until the 19th of December when they got the DNA hit saying he was in the house. That is not true. I gave a huge argument why that DNA was planted, because what happened, in my opinion, is law enforcement knew early on, probably the FBI, not Moscow Police Department, but the law enforcement knew early on that 2 people went to the house that night at least. It could have been a car with Brian Koberger dropping off one of the killers that went into the house. That killer could have been Brent Kopacka. That's the 2 suspects' names that are blacked out on a bunch of the paperwork, one of which they fucked up when they left Brian Koberger's name unredacted, showing Brian Koberger was one of the suspects as early as December 5th. They knew he was there. That's the hypothesis. Did the officers know Brian Koberger was there, and they even knew who the other person in the car was with Brian Koberger? Brian Koberger, however, in my hypothesis, didn't go into the house. Somebody else went into the house and they did the actual killings. Now, I don't believe that killer in my hypothesis. I don't believe that killer got back in Brian's car, because the DNA transfer would have been ridiculous. I don't care if you did strip out of your car naked. You're bringing some blood from that crime scene back into Brian Koberger's car. Brian Koberger's car was spotless. And no, it wasn't just because he had a month to clean it and all that shit. I don't even want to get into the stupidity of that. There's no way, in my opinion, the killer who was drenched in blood and would have been drenched in blood got back in Brian Koberger's car. So my hypothesis on this is that Brian Koberger delivered somebody to the house, found out that killings were going on, and panicked and took off when he heard the screams and left the scene. That would be one scenario. And it would also explain why Brian Koberger was there, and they knew he was there. Maybe they knew that who he delivered. That the problem was the killer himself later was shot and killed, and now they can't put the killer on trial because the killer's dead. They shot and killed Kopacka if he was the killer. And I've said that many, many times. I think that's the case. I think Othram Labs developed a DNA profile to Brent Kopacka, 4 brothers in Pennsylvania. I explained in a previous video why exactly I think that's Brent Kopacka. But here was the problem. They know Koberger drove Kopacka to the scene in this hypothesis. This is a hypothesis only. They knew Koberger drove Kopacka to the scene and that Kopacka went in and did the killings. The problem is that they ended up shooting and killing Kopacka, and now they can't put Kopacka on the scene. They're left with only other person that they know, which is Brian Koberger, who did the driving, who probably didn't go into the house. And so they're like, okay, we're going to go after Koberger as the person who committed this crime. We don't want to admit we fucked up and we killed Kopacka. There's reasons for that discovery, that hiding of the fact. So in the logic, in my logic, I said, I now know why Ann Taylor thought that there was planted evidence on Brian Koberger. They had reason to believe on the 5th of December, this was shortly after the murders, right, a couple weeks after the murders, they had reason to believe that Koberger was the driver who was there. And maybe they even thought he went into the house, but they couldn't prove it. They didn't have DNA and they didn't have any eyewitnesses. Nobody could put him in there. They tried to lead Dylan Mortensen to identifying Koberger. Was it possible he had bushy eyebrows? Is it possible he had a balaclava on? Is it possible this? You can see it in the documents if you're paying attention. The officers are leading Dylan.
So with DA's theory, I'm not saying I necessarily believe it, but if you can go with that and think outside the box, I want to take it a little bit further and say, we all remember Brian Koberger's questionnaire online regarding crimes. Now, super hypothesis, super speculation here, totally outside the box, but just bear with me. What if Brian Koberger was part of this NIJ study, and what if he was assigned to this crime that was already planned in advance for whatever reason, which is why, FBI and everybody was already in town for this rug ring takedown. But what if it was bigger than that? What if it was a psychological study? And what if all these people were involved? Brian, Brett Kopacka, FBI, NIJ, several different universities, including Catherine Ramsland, and so on and so forth. What if Kopacka was part of it? What if he was the one being studied for crimes and was assigned for this hit? And Brian Koberger was along for the study. And along with DA's theory, then that's how Brian Koberger's DNA got on the sheath. That's how they had Brett Kopacka's name when they shouldn't have. That's how they had Brian Koberger's name long before they claimed to have had it. Now, I haven't gone super deep dark down this rabbit hole. I just heard DA's theory a couple minutes ago, and I just had my brain kind of running off of his thoughts and thinking, what if this was a planned hit? This was an assignment. All these people are involved. He could have something here. I don't know how much I believe it. It just made my brain kind of think outside the box for a minute. Wondering if it makes any of yours. Real quick, I want to talk about the knife sheath again, and I want to take a look at the pictures of the spatter. I know, I keep beating a dead horse with this spatter, but I do want to take a look at it very briefly one more time, and I want us to just look at the pattern of the spatter again, because we are told that 3 different people's red fluid is on this knife sheath. And to me, it looks like there's only one pattern here. There's not a smudge or a leaking of fluid all over it. If it's just one pattern, which looks like it's from one blow, if you will, whether it was from blunt force or it was from a pew-pew, it looks like spatter just from maybe one wound. How would we get 3 different people's red fluid on the knife sheath when it looks like it's just one spatter from one wound? I would think if it was 3 different people's DNA, it would get there 3 different ways, which means maybe a smudge or a drop or a spatter. We have one tiny spatter pattern here rather than 3 different patterns of red fluid. I'm just curious how we have 3 different people's red fluid on this sheath when it doesn't really look like that at all. This point doesn't really have any bearing on anything. It just more so proves the point of how ridiculous mainstream media is and how I think we are all on the right track here, because Dylan's statement regarding the perpetrator that she saw was that they were 6 foot, tall, athletic, like a basketball player. Now picture a basketball player. Okay, now let's go over to Ashley Banfield and listen to the things that she says regarding Bryan Kohberger's selfies and his body shape in particular, and how she body shames him because he's not athletic and he doesn't look like a basketball player or fit that body type at all.
Actually shirtless in his bathroom, and he's saluting himself. Someone I believe is a freak. He's just not one of us. He's admiring his ass in front of the mirror in so many of the pictures. Originally, I thought it was just one. I thought it was just one picture with a new pair of jeans where he had the tag on it, and he was admiring his butt, or at least looking if his ass looked fat in those jeans. And the truth was his love handles were hanging out the hem, right?
So more or less, Ashley Banfield is just basically proving our point that even the body type doesn't fit with Bryan Kohberger. I think at this point we should just start calling Payne Perjury Payne. He's in some hot water here with some of his statements regarding IGG, December 19th, and when they had Bryan Kohberger's name, December 5th. I want to take a look at Pav's video for this point.
Where'd they get this name on the 5th of December?
And that last part, he said, my friends, is the $50 million question. Because when these reports were first released, I did some members videos as I went through these reports. And some of the first reports I went through on day one was the lab receipts, especially ones that listed Bryan Kohberger's name on December 5th. And then I noticed in further lab receipts, it listed Bryan Kohberger's name, and then it listed above his name, Bryan Christopher Kohberger. And then above his name, there was still a suspect that was always blacked out. Now, my assumption, and this is where I know a little bit too much about this case and the shenanigans that have gone on, where I think 3 steps ahead, and that does hinder me in some cases. Because I said, look, I know they didn't have Bryan Kohberger's name on December 5th, and because when they do put Bryan Kohberger's name in this report, they put it in there twice, Bryan and Bryan Christopher Kohberger. So my assumption was, look, they've gone back to this report and they probably covered Brent Kopacka's name with Bryan Kohberger. And they've just typed it in there before they released these reports to throw everybody off. Not really thinking about the impact that them releasing those documents with Bryan Kohberger's name listed in there, what it could really have. And let's take a look at that report, because whether they have gone back and typed Kohberger's name in there over Kopacka, or that was actually Bryan Kohberger's name and they just didn't redact it way back on December 5th, the impacts of either way, because they've released this stuff to the public like they're legitimate documents that were just redacted. by releasing those to the public, whether that's originally said Kohberger's name or not, now they've created a airtight case for probably the entire conviction to be thrown out, y'all. That's how big it really is. And now that I grasp the concept of what that really is, I got to show you how big it is. I mean, this case is over. It's over. Let me show you why. All right, so what he's referring to is this Idaho State Police Forensic Services evidence submission receipt. And it was on December 5th, and it lists Brian Kohberger right here as a suspect. Now, you can see I even had Kopak in there, and when I went through these, I told the members, I said, look, all they've done is they've superimposed Brian Kohberger's name over Brent Kopaka trying to hide this stuff. And it's very strange because when you look at the suspects right here, it lists two suspects. One actually typed out Brian Kohberger, which now that they've done this, I mean, they have utterly destroyed the entire case for themselves. And I'll show you why. Then it lists all these suspects or subjects. But this is an evidence submission receipt. Putting this on here really didn't have anything to do with what the submission receipt was for this particular evidence on December 5th, because it's a 5-page report. And then when you go down to what they were actually submitting, it's submission number 7. They were submitting buccal swabs from Jeremy Regan, Coy Nguyen, Derek Abenganya, Patrick Butner, and Cora Jalabu. And that was it. That was all they were submitting in this particular submission receipt, was these guys' buccal swabs into evidence. So having Brian Kohberger right here on December 5th, well, that isn't too bright for them. And then as you continue to go through, like the next evidence submission sheet, well, you'll see they only list one suspect, and Kohberger's not in there, and the box doesn't even, match how big Kohberger's was. And now we've got 3 suspects on January the 6th, right? Kohberger's already been arrested for the crime, but we still got suspect over here. We've got another suspect here, and they list the second suspect as Brian Kohberger, and then they list the third suspect as Brian Christopher Kohberger. So when I looked at this, I said, well, this has always been Brent Lee Kopaka, and they just went back and typed Kohberger's name on it. But whether they did or not, or if it originally said Brian Kohberger, they have utterly destroyed their own case. There was never any evidence connecting Kohberger to the crime. I've been through every report. So, and you can see they go through Brian's mattress pad, seat back cushions, and everything. Major crime prints from Brian Kohberger. This is on January 6th, though, 2023. And again, they've got 3 suspects listed, and they just went ahead and named 2 of them Brian Kohberger. So that's why I assume that one on December 5th was just Kohberger typed over Kopaka. However, since they did that, whether it's real or whether they fabricated it, it's all over, and this is why.
First, the affidavit. What did you rely on in the affidavit you wrote for the first AT&T search warrant on December 23rd, 2022?
It was a conglomerate of interviews, data received from cell phones, my observations of some surveillance footage that was taking place, various other things. Go down the line. If you can be more specific on specific parts, I'd be happy to tell you what I'd like.
Okay. There was a part of the affidavit where you talked about WSU officers identifying white Elantras.
Yes, ma'am.
And there was a part of the affidavit where you talked about 2011 to 2013 Elantras, and then it expanded to 2016 to include the year 2016 Elantras.
Yes, ma'am.
What I want to know first is what you relied on to expand that search from 2013 to include 14, 15, and 16.
That information was provided to FBI Special Agent Imel. He's a vehicle identification specialist. He used snapshots from the previously mentioned surveillance videos, and that was his determination on the types of vehicles we should be looking for, rather the year range we should look for. It would be in his report, we'd be more specific, but that was what I based the affidavit on, that portion of it.
I understand as far as when we get to 2013, but when we go beyond that, what did you rely on to get beyond that?
It would have been his input as an expert in vehicle identification. That's what.
Okay. Part of your affidavit talks about WSU officers finding white Elantras. And I believe there was an officer that you had some communication with. Do you recall the date you had that communication?
I do not recall the date. No.
Did you have some messaging system exchange with this officer to talk about that?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that the only means of communication you had with this officer?
No, ma'am. I believe I spoke to him on the telephone as well.
When you spoke to him on the telephone, how did that relate to the date of the messaging?
It would have likely been, if memory serves, it would likely been that same day.
Okay. Does December 20th, 2022 sound familiar to you?
Yes, ma'am.
And so this conversation with this officer from Washington, it related backwards to when he noticed an Elantra. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
But when he noticed it, you didn't know about that yet. Is that also correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so you don't know about him or talk to him until December 20th, 2022, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so here's the transcript from the January 23rd closed hearing on Franks, and Ann Taylor is questioning Brett Payne. And right here is Brett Payne on the stand in testimony stating, in the course of your responsibilities with Moscow police, this is Ann Taylor actually asking, in the course of your responsibilities with Moscow police, were you handling an investigation involving homicides at 1122 King Road? Yes, ma'am. What was your role? I was assigned lead detective after about the first 24 hours in that case. And does that mean that you have responsibility for the case and evidence? Yes, ma'am. Good grief, she could have been setting this thing up right here. Okay, as such, did you participate in a search for a suspect? Yes, ma'am. And when was the first time you heard Brian Kohberger's name? The first time I heard Brian Kohberger's name was December 19th, 2022. And what was that a result of? That was a result of investigative genetic genealogy that was being undertaken by the FBI. We had a phone call that evening and we were told Brian Kohberger's name. And before that, Mr. Kohberger was not on your radar? No, ma'am. Before December 19th, was the FBI CAS team member co-located with you? Yes, ma'am. How long had he been co-located with you? I don't remember exactly, but it had been several weeks at that point. And was that Nicholas Balance? Yes, ma'am. What other FBI team members were co-located with you? Goodness, a lot. We had technical assistant Maria Tyndall, Special Agent Jacobson, numerous other FBI special agents that were there to assist. And some of those included Michael Douglas and Ryan O'Neill. By the time it was December 19th and you first heard of Brian Kohberger's name, had you reviewed videotapes? Yes, ma'am. How many hours of videotapes do you think you reviewed? I don't remember. My point is, she goes through and gets Brett Payne to say over and over, December 19th was the first time he ever heard Brian Kohberger's name.
I mean, it would seem with this alone, Brian Kohberger would be able to walk free. I'm really curious where this information goes and if it does free him at all, or at least get him some sort of appeals going on. Translucent recently put out a video regarding access to the knife sheath, and it seems as if somebody by the name of Sharon Arredondo took out the knife sheath from evidence. For what reason, we have no idea. It was really fast, and then she put it back, but what could that have been for? And speaking of the knife sheath, so we have a knife sheath that has 3 people's red fluid on it, 1 an unknown male, and you want to swab a random area because it had a particle on it, which then apparently somehow, some way matched to Brian Kohberger, which whether it was planted or not is beside the point that I'm trying to make. It's the fact that you have red fluid from an unknown male DNA that doesn't match Brian Kohberger, and you didn't look into it or test it at all. It's baffling. It's absolutely baffling. And I think some of these points are starting to be recognized by both Vinny Politan on Court TV, as well as possibly Chris McDonough. It sounds like some of the guilters are starting to question the narrative a little bit.
Nate, so there's nothing directly connecting the killer to the actual victims, right? There was no, the nail clippings, there wasn't that DNA, there was no talk of anything like that. Am I correct in my analysis of the information that's been made?
Rightfully so. They should be questioning the narrative. They should have been questioning the narrative this whole time, just like you and I. All of the channels that I mentioned in this video will be linked in the description box below. That's what we have for you today. Do something nice for yourself. Be kind, but more importantly, be kind to your animals. Bye, guys.